Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Sunday, 24 November 2024. It is the 197th anniversary of the birth of Henry Thomas Buckle, who was born in London on this date in 1821. A listener has commented that many will be unfamiliar with the figures I profile, so I should give a brief account of the main doctrines of each individual discussed. I think that the most effective way to do this is to position the work of the individual in question in their biographical and historical context. For example, who influenced them and who they influence in turn, because this would also ideally take into account where someone gets their ideas, what they made of their ideas once they had them, and how they influenced others in turn with these ideas. So I'll try to give a little more of a background sketch of the figures I talk about, though many of these episodes are jumping off points for me to talk about what I find interesting in a given thinker, as this episode will be. So my going off on a tangent sometimes takes me some distance from my point of departure, which today is the work of Henry Thomas Buckle. Buckle stands a little bit outside the usual networks of influence since he was educated at home by his mother and later was an autodidact. As a young man, he was an accomplished chess player and defeated a couple of masters. Buckle traveled extensively in Europe with his mother and his sister, and later with his friends, studying the history and customs of each country he visited, which I think is the perfect education for an historian or a philosopher of history. Buckle's primary work was History of Civilization in England, published in 3 volumes starting in 1857. The work remained unfinished and was planned to extend over 14 volumes when completed. The book was remarkable in its time for being naturalistic in its approach and for Buckle's persistent effort to find a scientific way to study history. His understanding of his project was that he was writing a new kind of history of civilization in England, so he saw himself as a historian and not as a philosopher, and not as a philosopher of history, though he found himself default doing philosophy of history and philosophy of science as he tried to work out a scientific methodology for studying history. Volume 1 of his History of Civilization in England contains most of what's interesting in Buckle from a theoretical perspective, including most of what he has to say about his methodology. Volume 2 is mostly about French history, and Volume 3 is mostly about Scottish history. I haven't seen a breakdown of Buckle's projected plan for all 14 volumes, and I don't know if any such plan exists. The 1911 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica has an admirably systematic account of what Buckle was trying to do, given in 10 points. So I'm going to go through these 10 points, and as I go through them, I'm going to reframe Buckle in more contemporary terms to try to show the ongoing relevance of his work, which in its original terms now seems a little dated. So what follows are my paraphrases of the 10 points as named in the Encyclopedia Britannica article, and not the exact language that was used in that. So, number 1, little has been done to make history scientific. And a quote from Buckle to underline that. Quote, since the early part of the 18th century, a few great thinkers have indeed arisen who have deplored the backwardness of history and have done everything in their power to remedy it. But these instances have been extremely rare, so rare that in the whole literature of Europe, there are not more than 3 or 4 really original works which contain a systematic attempt to investigate the history of man according to those exhaustive methods which in other branches of knowledge have proved successful, and by which alone empirical observations can be raised to scientific truths, unquote. Here I am in complete accord with Buckle, and I have made this point many times, perhaps not so many times in this Today in Philosophy of History series, but often in my newsletters. History is not a science. Perhaps it could be, but it hasn't yet been made so, if it is capable of being a science. So, number 2, human actions, no less than natural processes, are governed by fixed laws. And a quote from Buckle, quote, The actions of men, being determined solely by their antecedents, must have a character of uniformity, that is to say, must, under precisely the same circumstances, always issue in precisely the same results. And as all antecedents are either in the mind or out of it, we clearly see that all of the variations in the results, in other words, all the changes of which history is full, all the vicissitudes of the human race, their progress or their decay, their happiness or their misery, must be the fruit of a double action, an action of external phenomenon upon the mind, and another action of the mind upon the phenomena, unquote. Buckle develops this theme by playing off divine predestination against what he calls the metaphysical dogma of free will. So, and which he also calls the infallibility of consciousness. So he's got these two forces, and he says they're both wrong. We've got a deterministic predestination and an indeterministic metaphysical dogma of free will. So according to Buckle, both the divine predestination idea and the dogma of free will distract us from a naturalistic determinism that sees history in terms of laws. Number 3, environmental factors are the chief influences on intellectual development. And a quote, if we inquire that what those physical agents are by which the human race is most powerfully influenced, we shall find that they may be classed under 4 heads, namely climate, food, soil, and the general aspect of nature. By which last I mean those appearances which, though presented chiefly to the sight, have, through the medium of that or other senses, directed the association of ideas, and hence in different countries have given rise to different habits of national thought. To one of these 4 classes may be referred all of the external phenomena by which man has been permanently affected. The last of these classes, or what I call the general aspect of nature, produces its principal results by exciting the imagination, by suggesting those innumerable superstitions which are the great obstacles to advancing knowledge. And as, in the infancy of a people, the power of such superstitions is supreme, it has happened that the various aspects of nature have caused corresponding varieties in popular culture and character, and have imparted to the national religion peculiarities which, under certain circumstances, it is impossible to efface, unquote. This, I think, places Buckle as a link in the chain of environmental determinism that I've talked about in relation to Montesquieu, Ellsworth Huntington, William McNeill, and Jared Diamond. So the idea isn't unprecedented. It has its prehistory in Montesquieu, but you could say that Buckle gave it its modern form. And in this sense, we can think of Buckle as a father of scientific history. The 4th point, in Europe, man has been more powerful than nature, while in other parts of the world, nature has been more powerful than man. Quote, I have looked at civilization as broken into 2 vast divisions, the European division, in which man is more powerful than nature, and the non-European division, in which nature is more powerful than man. This has led us to the conclusion that natural progress in connection with popular liberty could have originated in no part of the world except in Europe, where, therefore, the rise of real civilization and the encroachments of the human mind upon the forces of nature are alone to be studied, unquote. Again, this is a familiar idea of environmental determinism, not necessarily expressed how we would express it today, but clearly. And it not only draws on the influence of the thinkers I was talking about earlier, but also a familiar and I think older idea that the tropical climate is enervating, and so it produces weak types, whereas the temperate environments produce a stronger type of human being. Now, this has gone through all kinds of permutations through history, with some people unambiguously affirming it and some people unambiguously denying it. Toynbee had an interesting take in that he said, that Eskimos are an arrested civilization, because in Toynbee's schematism, every people or every culture is faced with a challenge and response. But if the challenge is too great, then the people can't even respond to it, and this makes an arrested civilization. So for Toynbee, Eskimos living in the far north are an arrested civilization. I wrote a blog post some years ago in which I think I called it "We're All Eskimos," because the reality of it is that we know now from anthropology and paleoanthropology and the like is that all our ancestors came through the last glacial maximum. So they effectively, everyone 25,000 years ago and before were Eskimos, as it were. They were people living in an extremely cold glacial maximum climate. And perhaps that delayed the formation of civilization. We do know that civilization pretty much got off to a start as soon as the Holocene warming began. So it's a mixed bag. We've got clear empirical evidence that could back up this claim, and we got clear empirical evidence that would contradict it, depending on how we interpret it. So it does seem to be the case that temperate environments are more of a spur to development than tropical environments. Whatever explanation we provide for this, or whatever argument we use to try to deny what seems to be the obvious manifestation of this. So, for example, many people have cited that in colder climates where there's a clear seasonality, and that means that crops and fruits come to season in a particular time of year, you have to plan for year round, and that means you have to store food, and that means you have to plan for the future, and that requires a significant amount of abstract thinking. Hunter-gatherers don't do that. Only people who have taken control of their food supply, that is to say, people who have established some minimal settled agriculturalism or a thoroughgoing a pastoralism where they're herding animals. Only in this case do we have people in control of their food supply, and they are then planning for the future of their food supply. I think the explanation that Buckle would give for this idea would differ from the explanation that, for example, Jared Diamond would give, but both are still working in a framework that demands a naturalistic explanation for climatological differences among peoples and civilizations. Okay, point number 5. Europe has advanced because mental laws have increased in influence as physical laws have decreased in influence. So once again, a quote from Buckle to underline this idea. Quote, mental laws are in Europe more powerful than physical laws, and that in the progress of civilization, their superiority is constantly increasing because advancing knowledge multiplies the resources of the mind, but leaves the old resources of nature stationary. On this account, we have treated the mental laws as being the great regulators of progress, and we have looked at the physical laws as occupying a subordinate place and as merely displaying themselves in occasional disturbances, the force and frequency of which have been long declining and are now, on a large average, almost inoperative, having by this means resolved the study of what may be called the dynamics of society into the study of the laws of the mind. We have subjected these last to a similar analysis, and we have found that they consist of 2 parts, namely moral laws and intellectual laws, unquote. And we'll return to this distinction that Buckle makes between moral laws and intellectual laws. Notice he says that natural forces were once the ruling force in human history, but now they've become almost inoperative. So if we think in the past, before civilizations were established, human beings were entirely at the mercy of floods or volcanic eruptions and all the catastrophes of nature that happen. But as we've developed the infrastructure of civilization, we're able to address these uncertainties, and we're more reliant on our human knowledge and our human institutions that cushion us in our dealings with nature, you could say. We could reformulate this claim of Buckle in a way that makes it more in line with 21st century presuppositions and make it a bit less reductivist, although it remains determinist if we state it in accordance with how Buckle wanted it. If we treat mental laws as emergence from consciousness and consciousness as an emergent from physical laws, we have something like Buckle's position. And the more a society is determined by later emergence compared to early emergence that recede into the background, the more that what Buckle calls mental laws predominate. So that's how I would prefer to state it in terms of emergentism. Since we saw earlier that environmental factors are the chief influences on intellectual development, there's a transitive relationship from environmental factors to intellectual development to mental laws. So whether we treat this transitive relationship from nature to mind to laws in reductive terms or in emergent terms, it works in either way. I would prefer an emergentist formulation, but I can easily imagine someone else preferring a deterministic framework for formulating that transitive process of one emerging out of the other. So the sixth point, an empirical method is necessary to grasp the mental laws that guide history. So another quote from Buckle, quote, "When men began to collect observations less minute but more comprehensive, then it was that the great law of nature, for which during many centuries they had vainly searched, first became unfolded to their view. If, therefore, we wish to effect anything of real moment, it becomes necessary that we should discard those old schemes, the insufficiency of which is demonstrated by experience as well as by reason, and that we should substitute in their place such a comprehensive survey of facts as will enable us to eliminate those disturbances which, owing to the impossibility of experiment, we shall never be able to isolate." Unquote. When Buckle is making this point, he contrasts what he calls a metaphysical method to an empirical method in order to show the inadequacy of a metaphysical method. And by a metaphysical method, he seems to mostly mean introspection of consciousness upon itself. In the bit I've quoted, he makes an important observation on the methods of scientific history, of what a scientific history would have to be. For example, he says that experiment isn't possible, and the facts we survey must be comprehensive. This is something that I've thought about for a long time, and I don't yet have any quantitative way to formulate what Buckle calls more comprehensive observations. But we can put the question like this: what kind of observations are relevant to civilization or to history? Not what Buckle calls minute observations, but more comprehensive observations. Minute observations might be what's relevant to paleolichenology. You have to use a microscope to look at the structural features of lichen fossils. But if you want to observe something big, like history or civilization, you need to have a big, or other words, comprehensive observation. I don't really know how we do that, but it's a fascinating question, and Buckle has clearly made it part of his methodology that whether or not you judge him to be successful, he understands the problem. So whether or not we follow Buckle's method, anyone who attempts to give a scientific account of history or of civilization will have to confront these same problems. So point number 7. Progress is due to intellectual activity and not to moral effort. Now, I said earlier that I would come back to this point of the intellectual activity versus moral activity, or intellectual effort versus moral effort that I mentioned earlier in relation to the another point. And this is where that comes in. So Buckle, quote, phenomena which the progress of society presents, the moral laws have been steadily and invariably subordinate to the intellectual laws. There arises a strong presupposition that in inferior matters, the same process has been followed. To prove this in its full extent, and thus raise To prove this in its full extent and thus raise the presumption to an absolute certainty would be to write not an introduction to history, but the history itself. The reader must therefore be satisfied for the present that what I am conscious is merely an approach toward demonstration, and the complete demonstration must necessarily be reserved for the future volumes of this work, in which I pledge myself to show that the progress of Europe has made from barbarism to civilization is entirely due to its intellectual activity, unquote. So this kind of goes under the radar here, but in traditional history, the explanations in terms of moral forces were preferred if these kind of intellectual forces in history were recognized at all. Now, some people who had a reductivist, physicalist account of history might not recognize either moral forces or intellectual history. But when historians do recognize them, they tend to focus on moral forces. But Buckle wants to kick this to the curb and show that it was really intellectual activity that is the driver of history. So, point number 8. The individual is an expression of the age defined by it and not defining it. So we could call this a rejection of methodological individualism, if you wanted to. It's clearly I didn't check the dates, but whether if Carlyle had already published his work on the great man theory of history by the time Buckle wrote this, but clearly he's at the opposite end from the spectrum of Carlyle. I mean, for Carlyle, the great man was everything. For Buckle, the great man was merely responding to what was going on in his time. So Buckle, quote, "Man, contrasting himself with the force and majesty of nature, becomes painfully conscious of his own insignificance. A sense of inferiority steals over him. From every quarter, innumerable obstacles hem him in and limit his individual will. His mind, appalled by the indefined and indefinable, hardly cares to scrutinize the detail of which such imposing grandeur consists," unquote. And then another quote, "The actions of individuals are greatly affected by their moral feelings and by their passions, but these, being antagonistic to the passions and feelings of other individuals, are balanced by them, so that their effect is, in the average of human affairs, nowhere to be seen, and the total actions of mankind, considered as a whole, are left to be regulated by the total knowledge of which mankind is possessed," unquote. So what Buckle is saying is that moral forces cancel each other out, but knowledge is cumulative, so it is able to influence history. And here we might invoke Thomas Kuhn's conception of science, which is not cumulative, or at least not cumulative across the board. If science has the cumulative structure that was traditionally thought, then Buckle would seem to be right. But if science is just a series of paradigms that irrationally follow one after the other, and there's no real advance of scientific knowledge, only a switch of paradigms, then it would be much harder to argue for Buckle's point. We can also find a resemblance to Karl Popper's argument for historical indeterminism based on the accumulation of knowledge. So Buckle was a determinist, at least to some degree, I think largely to a large degree. But his emphasis, and where I should say that Popper is very much a historical indeterminism. That's central to his work, the poverty of historicism. But Buckle's emphasis falls on how laws intrinsic to the intellectual sphere come to supersede laws intrinsic to the physical sphere. And for this reason, knowledge comes to be more influential than environmental circumstances. So this is a determinist account, unlike Popper, but like Popper, he's saying that accumulated knowledge is a driver of human history. Point number 9, religion, literature, and government are products and not causes of civilization. And a quote from Buckle, quote, Although religion, literature, and legislation do undoubtedly modify the condition of mankind, they are still more modified by it. Indeed, as we have clearly seen, they, even in their most favorable position, can be but secondary agents because, however beneficial their apparent influence may be, they are themselves the product of preceding changes, and their results will vary according to the variations of the society on which they work. Unquote. If we think about the origins of civilization, we inevitably come to the chicken and egg question of what came first. And this is what Buckle is getting at here. Buckle's resolution is that religion, literature, and government are essentially epiphenomena of civilization, though Buckle's unambiguous solution to the chicken and egg difficulty is conditioned by his willingness to accept that these forces do modify history, but they are much more modified than they are modifiers of history. So he allows them some causal effect, but minimal, secondary, as he says. And the last point, number 10, progress is a function of the interaction of skepticism and credulity. Now that would require a lot to flesh it out and make it comprehensible. Making a distinction between skepticism and credulity doesn't really even at all capture Buckle's meaning, and it's somewhat reductive to frame it in this way. But I still wanted to try to frame this 10th point in a way that I could get at what I think Buckle is doing, because it is a theme that runs through the whole work, but it runs through it by different names. So he doesn't throughout talk about skepticism and credulity. In fact, he uses those particular terms pretty rarely. For example, Buckle often calls credulity the protective spirit, and he gives us a very, very broad significance. He does mention the protective spirit throughout the books. Sometimes the protective spirit is manifested by superstition, and sometimes it's more like what Nietzsche called antiquarian history, a love for history in it of itself and for its own sake. Buckle wrote, quote, "The origin of veneration is wonder and fear. These two passions, either alone or combined, are the ordinary source of veneration." Unquote. So that's a clear statement of the kind of thing he has in mind with the protective spirit. Another quote from Buckle, quote, "Whatever increases in any country the amount of dangerous disease has an immediate tendency to strengthen superstition and aggrandize the imagination at the expense of the understanding." Unquote. So here he's introducing the protective spirit in relation to superstition. So superstition is another term that he uses throughout the book for this tendency. So for Buckle, the protective spirit was more developed in France, while England saw a greater development of skepticism. And so the Anglo-French rivalry throughout the Middle Ages and up into Buckle's time illustrates the distinction between skepticism and protective spirit. And the interaction between France and England then is this distinction playing itself out in real time and being one of the drivers of modern history. And Buckle writes, quote, "In an analysis of the French Revolution, I shall point out how that great event was a reaction against the protective spirit, while as the materials for the reaction were drawn from England, we shall also see it in the way in which the intellect of one country acts upon the intellect of the other, and we shall arrive at some results respecting the interchange of ideas which is likely to become the most important regulator of European affairs." Unquote. So much then for the 10 theses ascribed to Buckle in the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Buckle himself didn't summarize his work in this way or in these terms, except insofar as I've tried to quote a passage from Buckle to illustrate each of these as I could find something relevant. But these ideas do represent some of the major themes that Buckle developed throughout the book. Buckle died at only 40 years old and in Damascus, Syria. So it shows you that he was on the road quite a bit. He was traveling in the Holy Land with his friend John S. Stuart Glennie, and Stuart Glennie was with Buckle when he died. Not long after Buckle's death, Stuart Glennie, in his 1875 book, Pilgrim Memories, or Travel and Discussion in the Birth Countries of Christianity with the late Thomas Henry Buckle, recounted his travels with Buckle in Egypt, Sinai, Judea, Palestine, and Lebanon. Stuart Glennie writes that he had conceived a project not unlike Buckle's, although focused on law rather than on history or civilization. And in the preface to his book, he describes what he takes to be both Buckle's motivation and his own motivation. So here I'm going to make a longish quote. I couldn't really cut it back and leave all the juicy parts in. So I'm just going to read off this longish quote as it is. Quote, "But the discovery even of an ultimate law of history was not with me an end, but only a means. For through all the weak or worldly sophisms of contemporary presentations of Christianity, it was clear that the backbone of it as a religion is a certain theory or philosophy of history. It was clear that this Christian philosophy of history is opposed in the very conceptions that are its bases to that new philosophy of history, which, especially since Hume and Kant, has been the great and variously laboring aim of modern science to construct. And so, just as the Christian synthesis of history has been, it appeared that a scientific synthesis of history, expressed in the characteristic scientific form of a law, would be, in the moral or emotional presentation of it, an ideal, a religion. Clear it was, therefore, that the scientific inquirer who has for his aim the discovery of an ultimate law of history must aim also, if he has a true consciousness of the nature of his task, at discovering what will alone be an adequate basis of that new ideal rendered necessary by the incredibility now of the Christian theory of history. And clear also it was that, conversely, the religious inquirer who would gain a more satisfying ideal than that Christian one which science makes more and more incredible, must, if he has a true knowledge of the conditions of such an ideal, aim first of all at the discovery of an ultimate law of history. And the second, therefore, of my three main objects in recording these pilgrim memories is at the holy places themselves, to bring home to the reader the untenableness of the Christian theory of history, and so to prepare the way for that new ideal, which gradually dawns on us as we gain a glimpse of the law of progress, the law of human development," unquote. This is a fascinating testimonial, and I don't know how much of it Buckle himself would have endorsed, but since the two were traveling together and had made it all the way to Damascus, it seems likely that this would have come out during long conversations on trains and steamships, and maybe even on the backs of camels passing through the desert. Who knows? There is a biography of Buckle, but I haven't gotten a copy of it, and I haven't read it. I suppose I should. But all this, we see in embryo here so much that is assumed today about, a scientific account of history superseding a religious philosophy of history. It's a paradigmatic instance of Enlightenment thought. And notice that Stuart Glennie, excuse me, gives us his examples of this new scientific treatment of history. Hume and Kant were, paradigmatic Enlightenment philosophers. So another perspective on Buckle, Gilbert J. Garrigan, in his A Guide to Historical Method, places Buckle in the company of Marx. Quote, "Buckle and Marx, viewing history from an entirely materialistic angle, sought to reduce historical processes to the rigid uniformity characteristic of physical law. The attempt was futile, as must be any attempt that runs counter to nature, but the mirage of some ironclad law or laws as yet undiscovered that will unravel the skein of history and make its processes as clear as the solution of a geometrical problem has still power to intrigue the unwary, unquote. So true, so true. This is the other side, whereas Stuart Glennie was looking forward to this replacement of traditional philosophy of history with a scientific philosophy of history. Garrigan portrays this as a mirage and an illusion, which perhaps it is. Wilhelm Dilthey, while also differing from Buckle, gave a somewhat more sympathetic account of Buckle's project as follows, quote, "He asserts that among historians, a strange ideal prevails, that their business is merely to narrate events which they may occasionally enliven by such moral and political reflections as seem likely to be useful. He wants to transform history into an exact science like a natural history. He wants to demonstrate what is law governed in historical events and thereby put himself in the position of predicting them. He expresses the conviction that the law of necessity, that is, a cause and effect relation, prevails universally in the realms of historical as well as of natural events, that we must conceive of each individual action as the inevitable effect of certain causes that for their part are in turn effects of other events, that consequently we must totally exclude chance as well as providence or direct divine intervention from the sphere of history," unquote. It's interesting that Dilthey doesn't simply reject Buckle's approach, as many would and many have. Rather, he finds its utility limited, and he finds Buckle's conclusions are wrong-headed. But the project itself, Dilthey doesn't reject. He doesn't say it's impossible. And that implies that if the limitations he found were addressed and the conclusions were revised, Buckle's approach to history might be valuable. Perhaps Buckle's most dedicated critic was Lord Acton, who inveighed against Buckle in two essays, Mr. Buckle's Thesis and Method and Mr. Buckle's Philosophy of History, both published in The Rambler in 1858, while Buckle was still living. Lord Acton said that Buckle, quote, "is a gentleman who has had the rare fortune of jumping to celebrity at a bound by the publication of an elaborate book on a profound subject," unquote. Acton is clear about his dislike of Buckle and scientific history. Quote, "The whole system of positive philosophy is the work of undereducated or half-educated men, adepts in physical science, but ignorant of the principles of any other, who insist that all science must have the same method as theirs, and that metaphysical realities must be measured and explained by physical laws. We state this to show that Mr. Buckle's absurdities and dishonesties are not his own, but those of his school," unquote. With all these 19th century tributes to Buckle's influence, be that influence beneficent or malign, it's interesting that not many people read Buckle today. He hasn't come easily or readily into the modern world, even though he was at the cutting edge of scientific history in the middle of the 19th century. Buckle is sometimes even called the father of scientific history, but we've seen in several episodes that there's been a lot of confusion surrounding the very idea that history could be scientific. In my episode on Dilthey, I said that Dilthey thought that Hegel, Schleiermacher, and Comte were too scientific. Leo Strauss implied that Collingwood was a representative of scientific history. Many have claimed that Toynbee's work embodies a scientific or empirical method. And Henry Frankfurt complained that Spengler and Toynbee both were, quote, "under the spell of scientific notions," unquote. And for Frankfurt, that was a bad thing. All of these claims are things that no one would say today. But if we looked hard enough, we could probably find equally fantastical claims about what is and what is not science, and what scientific history is or ought to be. Not only do historians and philosophers of history disagree on whether or not history is or could be scientific, they also disagree on whether or not this is or would be a good thing. As we saw, the example of Henry Frankfurt, he thought that Spengler and Toynbee were too scientific and that that was a bad thing. But the great unanswered question here is not exactly whether history is or should be a science, but rather, if history is a science or could be made into a science, what kind of science is it? And this is a question that in turn points not so much to philosophy of history as to philosophy of science. And here we have to face a hard truth. Science itself is as unscientific as is history. And since I could be seriously misunderstood on the point, I need to try to clarify it. Just as there is no science of history, there's no science of science. And that means that our understanding of history and that our understanding of science is pre-paradigmatic, to use a Kuhnian term. It seems paradoxical that the individual sciences can be as well defined as any part of human knowledge, while the enterprise of science taken on the whole remains essentially unknown to us. If we could christen this paradox with a memorable name, maybe the realization of not knowing what we're doing when we do science or when we do history would get some traction and some theoretical attention. Whether or not this is a paradox, that is to say that the special sciences are scientific, but science itself on the whole is not, shouldn't surprise us, as it's baked into the very substance of science. Science progresses when it manages to hit on a productive set of abstractions that we can use to leverage a very narrow way of looking at the world. I said that science sometimes manages to hit on a productive set of abstractions, and this is key here, because given the lack of a science of science, there's no method of converging upon optimally productive abstractions. We can only cast around for them. Finding productive abstractions on which to base a science is fundamentally idiosyncratic. Some individuals have a much better feel for converging on productive abstractions than others. Better, in fact, than most of the rest of humanity. And this idiosyncratic efficacy is, again, a function of science remaining an art rather than being fully scientific. We should keep this in mind when we consider the ancient question of whether history is an art or a science, because science itself is an art and will remain an art unless or until we have a rigorous science of science. In the absence of a rigorous science of science, it would be nice at least to have a proof that a rigorous science of science is possible, or that, on the other hand, that it's impossible, but we don't even have this much. The narrower our science, the narrower the scientific abstractions we employ, and the more likely we are to make progress. The wider and more comprehensive our science, the more comprehensive the scientific abstraction we employ, the less likely we are to make quantifiable progress. And remember that the Buckle in his exposition said that in making a science of history, we have to look at comprehensive facts. So there are a couple of things going on here, and the distinction I've made between more comprehensive and less comprehensive abstractions. The most comprehensive concepts are employed in philosophy. And at some point in the narrowing of the meaning of concepts, as we focus in on things, we cross the threshold from doing philosophy to doing science. Passing in the opposite direction, when we start from narrow concepts, if we start from some very narrow specialities, earlier I mentioned paleolichenology, for example. If you start there and then you expand your concepts outward and you pass on to more comprehensive concepts, somewhere in that, if you keep going, you will pass the threshold from doing science to doing philosophy. Also, the more comprehensive the concept, the more foundational it is, and simple foundational concepts are related to each other and related to other simple foundational concepts, and this makes them difficult to grasp, difficult to elaborate, and difficult to systemize, because you can't take one on its own. There's a sense in which it's abstract, and you can treat it as abstract in the sense of each individual science. But when you take the whole thing, it is that problematic endeavor that we know as metaphysics. The absence of a science of science not only means that finding foundational concepts is idiosyncratic, it also means that we have no theoretical way of organizing science on the whole. And this in turn means that we have no taxonomy of the sciences within which taxonomy we could, if we had one, locate scientific history. In order to be able to say what kind of science history is or ought to be, which is something that a question I referred to earlier, we'd have to have a taxonomy of the sciences, but we don't have a systematic taxonomy of the sciences. There are a great many aspirational and attempted taxonomies of science, but none of them are theoretically satisfactory, and none of them are universally adopted. Just think of all the proposed scientific taxa that you've heard dropped casually at one time or another. When I came up with a list of empirical science, observational science, experimental science, natural science, physical science, social science, human sciences, earth sciences, life sciences, formal sciences, computer science, and so on. Where does one of these leave off and the other begin? Obviously, there's probably not going to be any clear, sharp dividing line, so the categories overlap and intersect like Wittgensteinian family resemblances. And it might be good enough for you to say that all the sciences exhibit a family resemblance, and it's this that makes them science and not the common possession of some essential property. This is certainly a line of argument that we could pursue, but it doesn't settle the question. It doesn't give us a theoretically adequate taxonomy of the sciences. It just tells us that there won't be a clear, bright line between them. So each philosopher who comes to the problem seems to end up formulating his own taxonomy that differs from all prior taxonomies of science, but all of which have been unsatisfying and none of which have been adopted by others. So we don't have a common language of a science of science in which we can formulate our definitions and taxonomies. And taxonomies are like definitions insofar as they help us organize our thought. But even without them, that doesn't mean that you can't continue to think about whatever it is you're trying to think about, whether it be science or history. The absence of a definition of science and an absence of a taxonomy of sciences on which philosophers agree doesn't mean that science is impossible or that scientific progress isn't possible. It doesn't even mean that philosophy of science isn't possible. In fact, we need philosophy of science as much as we do precisely because we can't divine science or divide its branches into a systematic taxonomy. The definition of science and a taxonomy of the sciences remain philosophical questions precisely because they have not been made into scientific questions. Consequently, our knowledge of science is incomplete. This is a distinct state of affairs from our knowledge of the world won through science being incomplete. But both of these are the case at present. Our knowledge of science is incomplete, and our knowledge of the world as reached through science is incomplete. Or to put it another way, we're pursuing knowledge of the world with an imperfect instrument that we don't understand, which means that any knowledge thereby gained by this instrument is also imperfect. And there may be an irreducible paradox that makes a science of science impossible, in which case we could never be able to say with certainty what kind of science a science of history ought to be. And the paradox is this: what kind of science would a science of science be? In other words, we need to have a taxonomy of science before we can make science scientific. But we can't make science scientific until we know what kind of science a science of science should be. In the form in which I've stated it, there can be no resolution to this paradox. Of course, you can reject my framing of the problem, but we seem to be in the position that mathematicians found themselves in after Gödel demonstrated his incompleteness theorems. A lot of people working in the foundations of mathematics a century ago felt like the bottom had dropped out of the discipline with the proof of the incompleteness theorems. Mathematician and philosopher of science Hermann Weyl said of mathematics after Gödel, quote, "The prevailing attitude has been one of resignation. The ultimate foundations and the ultimate meaning of mathematics remain an open problem. We do not know in what direction it will find its solution, nor even whether an objective solution can ever be expected at all. Mathematizing may well be a creative activity of man, like music, the products of which, not only in form but also in substance, are conditioned by the decisions of history and therefore defy complete objective rationalization. Unquote. That's from Hermann Weyl's Philosophy of Mathematics and Natural Sciences. And we could say, analogously to what Weyl is arguing in the passage I just quoted, that in history we are, or may be left to mere historicizing in the absence of ultimate foundations and complete objective formalization. Earlier, I said that sciences have to converge on productive abstractions, but it's the nature of abstractions that they abstract from much of the world, and that means that they are intrinsically incomplete. Wilhelm Windelband wrote about this in a way that strikes me as having really touched on the matter. This is a book that has been translated into English as Theories of Logic, but it originally came from a encyclopedia of philosophy and was just an article on logic in that. So I'm going to read a few excerpts from the last couple of pages from Windelband. Quote, "No description of facts can ever completely comprise or imitate the reality with which it is concerned, but it can weave the selected constituents into a form which agrees with their real interconnecting. The generic concepts and the laws of science are, of course, abstractions, but as such, cut off from all particulars, do not exist. The human sciences abstract from the endless mass of events, interconnections, which, as they present them to us, aloof from and unaffected by all the other things around them, have never come to pass. We men must content ourselves with this work of knowledge, fragmentary as it is, for it is our own original work, a new creation of the spirit, as much as our art and the moral life." Unquote. So, like Weyl, Windelband appeals to the example of art as the reference for knowledge obtained through scientific abstractions. So if we follow Weyl and Windelband, we may have to hesitate over the ancient question of whether history is an art or a science. We can't at present demonstrate that history isn't an art, and our inability to show that history is or can be a science is a spur to further thought. Reflecting on the nature of history may be a particularly conducive way to formulating a conception of science, because history has always had an embattled status, and that is a fertile ground for reflection. In my episode on Wilhelm Windelband, I talked about Windelband being the source of the familiar distinction between the nomothetic or law-like and universal forms of science and the idiographic or particularistic forms of science. So Windelband produced a bimodal taxonomy of the sciences, and in this way, he offered a definite answer to the question of what kind of science history should be. It should be an idiographic science. We might not agree with Windelband on this point, but at least he saw the problem that Buckle left and attempted to give a definitive answer to it. In this way, Buckle is not only the father of scientific history, but also the source of a fruitful line of inquiry in philosophy of history and philosophy of science. So happy birthday, Henry Thomas Buckle, and thanks for listening.